Thank you. I'm excited. And we have Dr. Kelly Brown with us to talk about her book, The Sound of Hope. And I'll just lead off with letting Kelly start talking.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for this invitation. I really appreciate being here. I know a lot of the people who are on here tonight, and some of you have been to at least one or maybe 20 of my talks. So you know a lot about the stories I'm going to share tonight. So today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a day set aside in April to remember the dead. And that's what we call it in English. In Israel, they call it Yom HaShoah. And so when the calendar rolls around to a Remembrance Day, there's also one in January, then we have to ask ourselves a question of how do we hold space for memory? And one of the things is that if we paused for 10 seconds of silence for every victim of the Holocaust, we wouldn't speak for well over 5 years. So it would be a deafening amount of silence. And I want to tell you about what Israel does. You can imagine that as a nation, this day is so intimately knit and woven into their lives. And so on Yom HaShoah at 10 a.m., they sound a piercing siren all over the country. And at that moment, everything stops. The cars on the freeway stop, the trains stop, people in businesses stop, people in the grocery store. There is a complete halt for everything. And people just stand in silence. They hold space for the memory of what has irrevocably changed their lives. And so we think about how maybe we respond or how a whole nation responds. What about an individual Holocaust survivor? How do they respond on a Remembrance Day? And so I wanted to share with you a quote by Dr. Edith Eger. She survived Auschwitz. And in her memoir, this is what she said about memory. She said that memory is sacred ground, but it's haunted too. It's the place where my rage and guilt and grief go circling like hungry birds, scavenging the same old bones. It's the place where I go searching for the answer to the unanswerable question, why did I survive? And I find that a really powerful statement about memory from someone who has, she's in her 90s now and continues to have this memory that she must contend with every day. And for me, I've chosen to tell some of their stories, to name their names and to hold space for them in my storytelling.
Kelly, I know you've been researching this book for a long time. Can you tell us about how you came to be interested in this topic and how the book came to be?
Sure. In many ways, I felt like that I have sort of been preparing for this my whole life by all these different things that I've been interested in and in music study and all that. But I can really point to a time in 2003 when I read a biography of Alma Rose, who was a wonderful violinist who was sent to Auschwitz. And there she used her music to help save the lives of people. And after I read it, it's really not an exaggeration to say that it changed my life. It certainly changed the course of my life because I wanted to know more about music's role in the Holocaust. And so I just began to research and discover stories of these incredible people and how music became a force in many of their lives for comfort and for spiritual resistance and even reconciliation. And there was also this horrible realization of the ways that the Nazis used music in harmful, hateful ways. They used it to manipulate people, to abuse and torture people. And it became even a cog in the machinery of genocide. And as I began to research, what I found is that there were lots of individual books written about one person or one place. Like, here's a book about Auschwitz, or here's a book about the Warsaw Ghetto. But what I began to see was a thread that connected them all together, that there was this power of music in these people's lives. And so trying to bring that narrative together is really how my book came to be. And I want to tell stories, but I don't want to do it through fiction. I want to tell stories in which I am narrating about the lives of people that I now feel deeply connected to, that through the course of my reading that I've developed some kind of a relationship with them. And I do feel very deeply about these people that I write about.
I could see that when reading the book. I mean, it was just, the narrative was just very well done.
Thank you. So I thought I would share a few of the stories tonight. And again, many of you have heard about these people or read about them. And I think, their names deserve to be said today. So I'm going to share my screen and talk first about Herbert Zipper. All three of the main people that we're going to look at tonight had their lives just completely interrupted when they were right in the prime of their careers. And so Herbert Zipper was born in Vienna. He was a child prodigy, really gifted at the piano. He wanted to become a conductor. And also, as his career was taking off in his 20s, he fell in love with this beautiful, gifted dancer. And so they had these careers that they were trying to balance and this relationship, but they both agreed that they would just delay getting married so they could focus on their respective careers. And so his conducting took him from Vienna to Dusseldorf, Germany. And there he encountered a man who sort of became a mentor to him. And this guy was so well connected, and he would have Herbert over for dinner all the time. And when Herbert would show up for dinner, there would just be famous people sitting there around the table. People like Albert Schweitzer or Igor Stravinsky. And so he got connected in that way. But then the Nazis came to power, and all of a sudden Herbert's Jewish ancestry became a real problem for him, and he became a target of anti-Semitism. And this man who had been his mentor and meant so much to him all of a sudden stopped answering the phone and stopped sending invitations. And it was a painful thing. And so he fled back to Vienna, but he wasn't in Vienna very long until the Nazis invaded Austria. And so he was arrested and sent to Dachau. And when he was in the cattle car on the way to Dachau, he decided two things for himself. First of all, he decided that he would not live in fear in this camp. And the second and more important thing is he rededicated himself to the practice of generosity. He decided that no matter what happened, that he was going to be generous and giving to those around him. And right away, the guards began to harass the prisoners and force them to sing songs, force them to pretend that they were happy to be there. And when they pointed to Herbert and asked him to sing, he just began to belt out Beethoven's Ode to Joy, just as a resistance to, what they were, all about. And it was a spiritual resistance for him. And they assigned him to become a human pack horse. And so he was to carry these heavy bags of concrete on his back all over the camp. But instead of going into despair or bitterness, he decided to use it as an opportunity to meet people and to take a kind word or recite a poem to a fellow prisoner. And soon he began to assemble groups of musicians, and they began to practice in secret in an unused latrine. And then they began to give these concerts, again in secret, for the fellow prisoners. And it did so much to lift their spirits. And then one day, Herbert was out walking near this gate, and it has that, infamous phrase that we see on the concentration camp gates: Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. And it was certainly a taunt, because there was no way to real freedom in the camp. And so he and his friend, Ura Sofor, who was a playwright, decided that they would write a song, a parody song, about what it was like to be a prisoner in Dachau. And so together, this is what they wrote: Dachau Lied, in German, Dachau Song. And in the stanza, we see their real life, the barbed wire that is death, no mercy, the frost in the burning sun, how they are so homesick and miss their loved ones, how they have to work, how they are afraid. And then you get the chorus, and the chorus is the parody part. Okay, it's the making fun, that they've learned the lesson now, and that they are going to all work together and be free in the end. And this song began to be sung in the camp. It began to be passed from one prisoner to another, and it was really their way of revolting. It was a spiritual resistance. And then as prisoners transferred from one camp to another, they took this with them. And so pretty soon, this song that had developed right here in this camp was all throughout the concentration camp system. Eventually, Herbert, because he was in the camp early on, managed to get a visa and escape. His father made that happen. It's something that wouldn't happen normally in a concentration camp, particularly much later, but he was in there earlier in the 30s. And so he finally married his beautiful Trudel, and they married in the Philippines. She had been offered a job in a dance department there in the Philippines. And it's interesting, because as I was researching this, I thought, did a bunch of people escape to the South Pacific? Did a bunch of Jewish refugees come there? And I found they did. They went to so many places. They went to Shanghai. Yes, they went to the Philippines. So she was there, and she secured him a job conducting the orchestra there. So he joined her, and they were able to be married, but they weren't there very long when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and then began to bring war to the whole Pacific. And so they found themselves in another leg of the war. And Herbert did some extraordinary things to help the U.S. Army, to help General MacArthur. He also wanted to make sure the orchestra could play again after the war, and so he hid their instruments, he hid their music. And as the war was finally coming to an end, he really wanted to stage a victory concert. And so he began to assemble what members he could find. There had been so many casualties in Manila from bombing, from Japanese soldiers, from starvation. And he appealed to General MacArthur himself and said, I need money for supplies, and I need food, because we need to bring music back to Manila. And MacArthur gave him everything he asked for. And so he did stage a concert of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Heroic. And you could still hear bombs falling in the distance as they had this great concert. And it was so successful that the U.S. Army asked him if he would give one concert a week. And he agreed, and he did that for the next 52 weeks. And he and Trudel finally decided that they wanted to make their home in the United States. And so they came, and he began to work to bring music to especially children in underserved populations. And even when he was 91, he was still bringing music. He had traveled all over the world. And all of this was because of a choice that he made, crammed in a cattle car on the way to a concentration camp, that he was going to live generously. So I'm happy to name his name tonight as part of our Remembrance Day. I always want to think about Alma Rose, who is the first person whose story that I learned. And it's so interesting to me that she grew up at the same time in Vienna as Herbert Zipper. But what we don't know is whether they ever met. And it seems like surely they would have met each other. Vienna's a big city, but the musical world can be quite small. But we don't really know. So even though they're both really talented musicians, there was a difference with Alma Rose, and that's because she was a member of musical royalty. Her uncle was Gustav Mahler, the great composer and conductor. You can see Alma's mother, Justine, there with her brother, Gustav. Her father was Arnold Rose, and he was one of the most famous violinists during this time. He was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and the Vienna Opera Orchestra, and he had founded a very famous quartet called the Rose String Quartet. They had premiered works by Schoenberg, including his Verklärte Nacht, which is a very famous piece for strings. And so Alma led a very privileged life, as her family just hobnobbed with all the socially elite and the musically elite of Vienna. And she studied violin starting at age 5 with her father. He gave her a lesson every morning, which I find really interesting because it's very hard to teach your child anything if you've ever tried that. But she adored her father, and they got along quite well. And he was very serious about her becoming a great violinist, and he would not let her play any sports because he was afraid she would damage her hands. And by the time she was 12, she was practicing 6 hours a day and was already accepted to the Vienna Conservatory. And so, like Herbert, she was right in the prime of her career in the early 1930s and was making a name for herself when the Nazis invaded Austria. And because they were Jewish, they were immediately banned from performing. Her father was fired from these orchestra posts that he had held for 50 years. He was fired from the conservatory. Their names were blacklisted. They were not allowed to perform. Any recordings were not allowed to be aired on the radio. There was just the complete silence of this famous family. And so they finally escaped. They fled to England. This is a photo from the newspaper that announces the arrival of these famous musicians into London. But the problem was they've escaped with their lives. They did manage to escape with their instruments, but that was it. This once wealthy family was now penniless, and they were depending on gifts from friends. And so Alma felt a responsibility to care for her father, to support them. So she got a performance job in Holland. And so she left England. She left the safety of England and went to Holland. She thought it would remain neutral as it had in World War I. But of course, it was invaded by the Nazis and she was trapped there. She tried to escape to Switzerland, and she was only 90 minutes from the border of Switzerland when she was arrested by the Gestapo and she was sent to Auschwitz. You can see that same phrase here, that Arbeit macht frei, above the gate of Auschwitz. There's always something interesting about this phrase on this particular gate. If you look at the word Arbeit, you might see it. You'll notice that the B is upside down. The prisoners who were charged with forging this, they had the metal and they had to put the letters on there as an act of resistance. They soldered in the B upside down, and it was not noticed. And so I love to bring up these moments in which people who seem to be in such impossible situations still had the courage to stand up in whatever ways that they could. So when Alma came to Auschwitz, she was assigned to go to Block 10, which was the experimental medicine block. This is where Dr. Mengele did his experiments. And when she got there and looked around, she saw what was happening and she thought, I'm going to die in here. And she asked one of the prisoners who was working in that office for a violin. She said, go get me a violin. She wanted to play the violin one more time. And because she was so famous, this is one of the interesting things. Here she is, a Jew, a prisoner, and yet she has international renown. So she has a bit of a different status as this famous prisoner. And so indeed, a violin was brought to her. And she began to play it, and she began to give nightly concerts in that ward for the poor women who were being experimented on. And these concerts saved her life because the prisoners who were working kept her name off of the experiment list. And so this went on for a period of time. And then eventually her presence just couldn't be kept a secret. Yeah. And Maria Mandel, who was the head SS of the women's camp, found out about it, and she had her transferred to the music block. And that's when Alma discovered that there was an orchestra in Auschwitz, something that we wouldn't think of. Why were there orchestras? But this wasn't rare. This was very common in the concentration camps. Auschwitz actually had 3 prisoner orchestras, and you can see that one of the men's orchestras here. And there are many reasons why there were forced orchestras of prisoners. Okay, this is not a volunteer group. Okay, this is not joining a community orchestra. This is forced music labor. It's one of the only examples in all of history that I know of when people were forced to make music at gunpoint. And one of the reasons is the Germans loved music, and they wanted to be surrounded by music, and they wanted to be entertained. They wanted concerts. Orchestra members were on call 24/7 to play music. But also the orchestra formed this marching music, this morning and evening marching music, as the prisoners marched out the gate to their work details and marched back in. You can see in this drawing that a prisoner made in the camp, the orchestra playing as this, what I'm assuming is the evening march back in takes place. You can see that some people are so exhausted that they're having to be carried. And you could also imagine that playing in this orchestra and not going out to do this hard labor did not make the orchestra members very popular among their fellow prisoners. They often hurled insults at them or even spat at them. They considered them to be collaborators because their music was forming their death march in a way. But also these orchestra members had no choice. They were either play, or be killed. If you're familiar with Primo Levi, who was a survivor from Auschwitz that wrote an important memoir about his time there, he said the one thing that would always be the camp for him was this marching music of the orchestra. So Alma was forced to become the conductor of the women's orchestra. There are no photos of them, but you can see this sketch of her and the women. And it wasn't an easy job because unlike the men's orchestra, the women's orchestra was made up mostly of amateur players. These were not professional players because women were not allowed to be in professional orchestras during this time period. And it was not also your usual group of instruments. There were lots of folk instruments, so mandolins and guitars, in addition to some violins and some flutes, and eventually there's a cello in here. So it was really hard, but Alma understood right away that she could help save these women's lives. That if the Nazis indeed wanted this music, which they did, that she had some leverage to get extra rations or to get a stove for their barracks. She also knew that the more she could help them improve, then the better their chance of survival. And so she worked really hard to help them improve musically. She had to write all the music they played because there was no music written for this group of instruments. So she often stayed up all night to arrange music. And they, within a short period of time, had a repertoire of over 200 pieces. It's quite amazing. And so I wanted to tell you about a couple of people who Alma helped save. And this is Esther. Esther was sent to Auschwitz in 1943 when she was a teenager. And they were trying to get this women's orchestra together. And so they asked her to come and audition because they heard that she could play the piano and that she could sing. But there was no piano yet at that time. And they handed her an accordion. And they said, if you can play this accordion, you can join the orchestra. Pretty much, if you can play this accordion, you have a chance of surviving. And she said she had never held an accordion before in her life. And she had about 60 seconds to figure out how it worked. And she did. And she passed the audition. And so music saved her. And then there's Anita. Anita was sent to Auschwitz that same year, 43, as a teenager. And as she was going through the line of where they would shave your head and tattoo a number on your arm, the prisoner who was doing this work asked her, what did you do before the war? And she said, I played the cello. And the prisoner said, fantastic, you'll be saved. And Anita was asked to stand to the side. And she said she was standing there with her head shaved and she was completely naked. And this elegant woman came toward her. She said she was a prisoner, but she was very elegant. And she said, do you indeed play the cello? And Anita said, yes, I've studied quite seriously. And the woman said, my name is Alma Rose, and you're going to be in the orchestra. And so that was an invitation to life. And I'm so happy to tell you that Esther is still alive. She's 95 years old. She's still playing the accordion. She plays in a band called the Microphone Mafia. She is quite hip. And just this past October, she won the Hermann Moss Prize for her life's work in pursuit of racial and social justice. And she's doing that through her music because she remembers the fundamental truth of when she was in Auschwitz, which was, as long as I play, I live. Anita also survived and is still alive today. She is 95 years old. As far as I know, these two women are the only ones who are still alive from the orchestra. But as we celebrate that today and as we honor their lives, I also want to say that surviving is not easy. There's an incredible weariness that comes from the responsibility to bear witness for so many years. And when Anita speaks, I can see that strain on her face and in her voice. She has had over 75 years of telling what happened to her in Auschwitz. She has never known another life. And it's also hard for them because they have to not only have what we would call survivor's guilt, but reconcile their role as orchestra members. And what Anita often says is that we played with tears in our eyes and guns in our backs. And it's so wonderful that so many women survived from this particular orchestra because of the wonderful work of Alma Rose. Sadly, she did not survive the war, but she died in Auschwitz on April 5th, 1944. So the anniversary of her death is just a few days ago, very close to our Remembrance Day. So may her memory always be a blessing. And I have one more story to tell you tonight. There are lots and lots of them in the book. It's always hard to pick who I'm going to talk about, but we'll conclude with Alice. And there's so many things about Alice's life that sort of parallels Alma's. She was a child prodigy, this fabulous pianist. She was from Prague, and she came from a wealthy, influential family. Her mother was well educated. Her father was a successful businessman. He was one of the first people in Prague to own an automobile. And again, her life was interrupted in the 1930s when the Germans invade Czechoslovakia. But as we're leading up into those years, Alice finds true love in Leopold's summer, and they marry in 1931, and then they have this son named Rafi, and everything is so wonderful for them. And then, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and they are sent in 1943, the same year Alma is sent to Auschwitz. They are sent to Terezin. Terezin is the Czech name. The Germans called this camp Theresienstadt. It's about 30 kilometers outside of Prague. They officially labeled it a ghetto, but it functioned as a concentration camp. And the Nazis specifically sent members of Prague's artistic circles, composers, conductors, writers, artists, philosophers, just an incredible group of people were sent here. And with them, lots of talent, ability, and then also they were put in this terrible situation of overcrowding, disease, hunger, lack of medicine. They were in a terrible suffering situation in this place. And they also were fearing daily of the transports, because Terezin not only was sort of its own camp, but it was also serving as a way station to extermination camps. There were trains leaving all the time to Treblinka and to Auschwitz. And what we see develop in Terezin is really unusual. We see music in a different way. Okay, we don't see prisoners forced to make music. We see these musicians who've all been assembled together, and this is what they do. And so they spontaneously begin to make music, but it's forbidden, and they do it in secret. There's one cellist who finds out that he's being deported to Terezin, and he takes his cello apart in small pieces and hides it in his luggage. And he takes some glue with him, and when he gets inside the camp, he glues the instrument back together. That's what music meant to them. But in time, the Nazis sort of discover this forbidden music, and they have an idea. They decide, you know what? We could use this to our benefit. If we show them doing all these great concerts and recitals, we could prove to the world how well the Jews are faring, how well we're treating them. And so they did. They began to use this as a false message to the world. They even fooled a contingent of Red Cross representatives who came here. So Alice became one of these important musicians in Terezin. And while she was there, she gave over 100 piano recitals, all from memory. She taught the children piano lessons in secret because they weren't allowed to educate them. And what she discovered that the other prisoners also seemed to discover was that music was so vital to them. And after the war, some people didn't understand that. And they said, how in the world could you play music in such a horrendous situation? And Alice would always say, music was life. We did not, could not, would not give up. And that's this kind of spirit of determination and resilience that we honor today and that we hold space for. But I do want to note that music did not bring comfort or serve as spiritual resistance for everybody. We can't paint this broad brush and say that music was wonderful for every prisoner in a concentration camp. It certainly wasn't. And anybody who had an experience that was different than that, their experience is as valid as those who used music for comfort. Some felt that their music had been stolen from them. It had been used as a weapon, and so now it was tainted. And when they survived the war, they could never play music again. There was one violinist in Auschwitz who was forced to play the French national anthem while a French prisoner was hanged. And he could not live with how his music had been used as part of that death. And so he committed suicide in the camp. Alice did survive the war, as did her son, Rafi, who was 6 when he was in the camp with her. But her husband and her mother were both murdered. Alice found out toward the end of the war, when they were still in Terezin, that it was her music specifically that had saved them. A guard came up to her and whispered, "I love your music, and when you play the piano, I stand outside the window. And because of that, I have made sure that you and your son don't show up on the deportation list." So Alice and Rafi went back home to Prague. And he was an incredibly gifted child, and she began to work with him musically. But Prague did not feel like home anymore to Alice. The anti-Semitism was still there. The people who had hated her a few years before and wanted her to be killed were still there. And the Soviet Union had come in and taken over Czechoslovakia. And so she felt that one tyranny had been exchanged for another. So she and Rafi immigrated to Israel. And he became an internationally renowned cellist. And she taught at the Jewish Academy there. Eventually, both of them resettled in London. And so Alice not only survived, but she thrived. When she turned 100 years of age, she was still practicing the piano 3 hours a day, all from memory. When she died in February of 2014, she was 110 years old. She was still playing the piano. She was the oldest known Holocaust survivor. She was such an inspiration to anybody who ever met her. And they went away with a kind of beauty that they didn't know existed, a beauty that they didn't know that you could generate, a resilience they didn't know you could generate after what had happened to her and her family. And so I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes of Alice's, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. "Life is beautiful. You have to be thankful that we are living. Wherever you look is beauty. I know about the bad things, but I look for the good things.
Wow. So, Kelly, what do you hope readers will take away with them after they read this book?
Empathy is one of the things. I try to, in the book, paint really vivid portraits of the sights there, the sounds, the smells. I want people to find themselves there. And hopefully in doing that, that they will connect with these people, that they will feel empathy. And from that, then they will go forward with kind of as a means of social justice and racial justice. We need that in our world. We need to advocate for that. We need to use the arts for that, because the arts are a perfect means of achieving this kind of message. And so I hope that's what people will take away from it.
Kelly?
Yes.
Can you, something that I know there's so much in the book, you can't talk about all of it. Can you tell us a little bit about the Violins of Hope?
Yes. So the Violins of Hope is a good example of how reconciliation can happen through music. The last chapter in my book is called Out of the Ashes. I was trying to end the book with what things have come, what beautiful things have come from this horrific, dark moment in our history. And so the Violins of Hope is one of those things. Amnon Weinstein, who is a violin maker in Tel Aviv, Israel, he began to collect violins that were played during the Holocaust and restore them. And then he began to travel all over the world, bringing these violins to cities and performing. And the whole reason that he does this is because of one day in the 1980s, he was working in the shop with his father, who was also a violin maker. And an elderly man brought a violin in and said, I played this instrument in Auschwitz, and I want it to be restored to give to my grandson. And Amnon said he and his father took the top off the violin, and it was full of ash. And it was the ash that had rained down from the chimneys in Auschwitz. And that was a defining moment in his life. And so now he has over 80 violins, and he's traveling all over the world. Of course, he had to stop right now because of COVID. Right before COVID, in January of 2020, he came to Knoxville, and I got to go see the violins perform. And the whole reason behind this is that when you play an instrument, there's something of you in that instrument. And the violin is particularly important to the Jewish people. It's really their most important instrument. And so the voices of those who can no longer speak, who have been silenced, come alive again through the playing of their instruments. And it's a beautiful way to educate people, and it's a beautiful way of remembering.
Thank you.
Hey, Kelly.
Yes.
This is Gail Pressler. How long have you been researching this book?
Almost 20 years.
Wow. And we don't have a copy of it yet. Does Glenn Moody have your book yet? I Love Books.
I don't know that Glenn has it. The library does have a copy.
We do. I had it checked out. I was bogarting it. Sorry.
That's okay. I'd like to get a copy.
Yeah.
For Milton and for me to read, and then we don't have to worry about paying overdue fines or any of those other things.
Yes, well, Amazon will hook you right up.
Well, I'll give Glenn a chance, and then I'm
okay.
Books a Million. I try to not make Jeff Bezos any more richer than he is. So that's one of my personal goals in life. So
yes, I understand that. It's been really interesting to have a book released during a pandemic. I've spent all this time getting the book ready, and I had all these plans for, in-person things and signings and all of this, and then so we're in pandemic, and bookstores don't have very much traffic, and they don't want to add to their tables. And so it's been interesting, but there have been so many blessings in the virtual world that we've been able to create, and so many opportunities that have happened globally for me that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been in pandemic. So it's kind of a collateral beauty that came from that.
Kelly, thank you for giving Anne a book. The only chapter I read was St. Petersburg, Stalingrad. Would you kind of summarize that in about 30 seconds or a minute?
30 seconds. Wow. Okay.
I know.
Yeah. And you have to read more chapters, Lynn, right? There's a test.
I'll do that.
Yeah, there'll be a test on that. Yes.
I've got Anne's book,
Okay. Well, you get to reading. So one of the things that I also did in the book was I looked at what happened to composers like Shostakovich, who found themselves caught up in the middle of the war. They weren't necessarily Jews who were sent to concentration camps, but Shostakovich was living in Leningrad when the Nazis surrounded it and had the terrible siege of Leningrad, in which millions of people starved to death. And he began to write a piece of music while he was trapped in Leningrad. It became his seventh symphony. And eventually, Stalin evacuated him and his family. And so this particular piece became an important part of the Russians trying to win the war. They were using this piece of music as a means to win the hearts of Americans who would give money and send supplies for the war effort. This was before we were committed to the war. And so it became an important kind of rallying cry for all Russians to, come to the aid of Mother Russia and to defeat this enemy. And it had a profound effect on the Russian people. They heard this music by their beloved composer, and they said, we can survive, we can prevail. And it was really a wonderful testament to the power of music. Lots of good questions.
Kelly, how has researching and writing this book affected your relationship with music?
Talk to you soon. Get y'all over.
Yeah, well, it's certainly deepened it. There's a lot of different ways that this book has affected me, not just my relationship with music and how I see music so much more intimately connected to us as individuals, but also the kind of a global connection, and then the relationships that I've made with survivors and the families of survivors. And I've made some lifelong friendships with people who I talk about their families in my book. And that's been one of the most surprising things. It started out sort of as an academic endeavor, and I'm sitting there with stacks of books and searching digital repositories. And then all of a sudden I began connecting with live people. And it was really inspiring to me.
How has it, this is Lynn again, how has it brought you closer to your students? Or has it?
It has, because I tell these stories now in class, and I try to figure out often how to work them in. Some classes are easier to work it into, but I try as much as possible to weave it in. I'm teaching violin lessons, so it's easy to think about, violinists or pieces they played in the camps. And in music history, for sure, we talk about this and what happened in the 30s and 40s, and the loss of so many people, and the loss of a tradition, and the silencing of people who were so important in the whole culture of Western music that all of a sudden were blacklisted and were silenced, and what happens to composers like Wagner, who have this, this reputation for anti-Semitism. And now what do you do with his music? And we talk about that a lot. Can you separate the person from their creation? Can you separate the artist from what they've made? I mean, Wagner's music is so wonderful, and his politics and his personal life are so abhorrent. And so how do we address that? And I don't always have good answers for that, but I raise the questions, and so we talk about the questions.
I feel like that's an ongoing topic in the library world for sure, because it's the same thing with authors and their books, talking about, can you separate the author from their work? And I think that's definitely an ongoing conversation right now.
Yes.
Kelly, one other thing that this is about the vocal orchestra.
Okay.
And this was actually in the Far East that is in your book. And not only were there violinist and orchestral performances, but then in this prisoner of war camp in Sumatra, they created a vocal orchestra, no instruments, but a gifted musician figured out how to have these women sing the notes of orchestral pieces. And so it was, to me, that was inspiring, that out of nothing, this woman from memory created all these pieces that the women prisoners could perform.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really interesting and inspiring story. It's very different from some of the other things in the book. Again, these were not groups of Jewish prisoners. These were English and Dutch women who were mostly wealthy. They were living in these English and Dutch colonies out in the Pacific. They were living in Singapore and Malaya. And so as the Japanese began to come through there and take over these islands, they were fleeing. And the British government waited a really long time to evacuate the women and children, because they felt stubbornly and very erroneously that the Japanese could never defeat the mighty British army. And so they waited too late. And finally, by the time they decided, you know what, this is lost, Singapore is going to be taken, then they put women and children on boats and sent them out into the ocean where the Japanese were waiting for them, and they bombed them. And so they took them prisoner. But there was a camp, a POW camp for women and children, where music became an important part, where they had no instruments. It wasn't like in a concentration camp where the Nazis had confiscated all these instruments, and so there was a storehouse of instruments. They had nothing. Most of them had lost everything in the water because their ships had been bombed, and they had found themselves floating, holding on to a piece of wood till they floated up onto an island. And so there was a missionary. She was a Presbyterian missionary and an organist, and she had an eidetic memory for music. And so she began to write out the parts of Dvorak's New World Symphony and Ravel's Bolero and all these famous pieces. And the women sang them with oohs and ahs. And one of the reasons they used the syllables is because they didn't often share the same language. Some spoke Dutch and some spoke English, and so they could use these syllables to create this beautiful music. And you can buy these arrangements. The original arrangements are still available, and people perform them. The Milligan Choir Women's Chorale has performed 2 of them this semester. If you look for our playlist on YouTube, here's just a plug for that. The Milligan.
That's great. I was going to ask. I wanted to hear this.
You can hear that. You can also buy the recordings of the vocal orchestra music. There was a film made about it that starred Glenn Close called Paradise Road, and the soundtrack features all of those. And it's an incredible story. And one of the women who survived, I've been able to talk to her daughter multiple times, who lives in Amsterdam, and she's told me a lot about her mom and shared photos, and it's a wonderful, inspiring story.
I have one personal thing that I've found. There is a Holocaust museum at the foot of the island of Manhattan in New York City. When you walk out the back, you see the Statue of Liberty. And somehow that was just terribly symbolic to me, was to step out the back where it's kind of a graveyard with stones that are Jewish symbols of those that died. And you look across the water, and there's the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Or Kelly, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I think Karen has some things to say about bookmarks and book plates.
Sure.
My room is dark, but can you all see?
Yes.
Kelly has graciously provided to us bookmarks that she signed on the back. And then she has signed our Friends of the Library book plates. So if you have purchased a copy of her book, you may pick up at the circulation desk at the library a signed book plate that you can put inside your copy, your personal copy of the book. So since we're not able for her to do a book signing for us, you can have a signed book plate to go in your copy. As if she had signed it for you. So those are, both of these items are available at the circulation desk at the library, and you can just stop in and ask, and they'll get one of each of these for you. So thank you for doing that for us, Kelly.
Yes, thank you for having that idea. That's really wonderful. I think I'll end with this really short poem. This is by one of the women who was in this camp that we're talking about in Sumatra. She is not someone who survived to see the end of the war, but this is a poem she wrote while in the camp, and I think it sums up what we're talking about tonight. I go my way singing, whate'er fate be bringing. I go my way singing, the world's my friend. Oh, life's not for sorrow, no trouble I'll borrow, a fig for the morrow, I'll sing to the end.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Kelly. So enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.